Ever get that feeling with a book? Like, it's got secrets, but they're meant just for you.
Oh, I know that feeling.
Yeah, that's kind of the vibe I was picking up prepping for today's deep dive into The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary.
By Karl von Eckartshausen, right?
The one and only. I gotta admit, it's not exactly a household name, this Eckartshausen fellow.
Not exactly a bestseller now.
Ugh. But there's something about this book, the way it's kind of moved through history, you know? Under the radar, but persistent. First popping up in some philosophical magazine way back in the late 1700s.
Then he gets his own book deal.
A French translation even. Like
Wow.
someone, somewhere, keeps finding this book, keeps thinking it's got to be shared.
It's like a whispered secret that keeps getting passed along.
Exactly. And that whisper's like, hey, there's something really important here, but you got to be looking for it, ready to do some looking.
Let's dive in.
So, for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to Occult Archives. We're all about cracking open history's most, shall we say, intriguing books.
The ones that maybe sent a shiver down your spine back in the day.
Or still do, if you're not careful. Mystical grimoires, ancient secrets, all that good stuff. And today, we're tackling episode 265, all about the cloud upon the sanctuary. We're talking hidden churches, forbidden knowledge, and a whole conspiracy of, well, divine wisdom, apparently. But before we get too deep into the weeds, I think it's worth highlighting just how seriously Eckartshausen was taken by folks who knew their stuff.
Oh, absolutely. You look at who this guy was connected to. Johann Caspar Lavater, for one.
For those who haven't bumped into Lavater before.
Well, he was huge into physiognomy, this idea that you could read a person's character just by looking at their face.
Like a face-based personality test?
Kind of, yeah. Anyway, Eckartshausen was rubbing shoulders with him. Plus, he was tight with Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, who's a pretty big deal in French mystical circles.
Huh?
And then there's this Swiss counselor, Kirchberger. He described Eckartshausen as, and I quote, a man of immense reading and wonderful fertility.
Dude must have had a library card that was worn thin.
Seriously. Kirchbergers even planned a whole trip just to go meet Eckartshausen, hoping to get some deep wisdom straight from the source, like he was expecting the lost word or something. When people are traveling across countries for a chance to chat, you know there's got to be something special there.
Talk about high expectations. Okay, so we've got this kind of mysterious figure, Eckartshausen, respected by some heavy hitters, writing this book that's all about, well, what exactly? What's the elevator pitch for The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary?
It boils down to this. Eckartshausen believed that we all have the potential to tap into, let's call it, essential wisdom.
Essential wisdom. That's a loaded phrase right there.
It is. And for Eckartshausen, this wisdom is basically synonymous with Jesus Christ.
Okay, so already we're getting into some pretty specific territory here.
We are. But the way to access this wisdom, according to Eckartshausen, is through turning inward. He says we all have this, like, dormant spiritual faculty within us.
Like a sixth sense, but for the spiritual realm.
Exactly. And when this faculty wakes up, we start to experience spiritual realities just as directly as we experience the physical world. Like no filter, no guesswork.
So it's like we're all walking around with this built-in spiritual antenna, but for most of us, it's just not getting any signal.
Pretty much. And that's where the cloud upon the sanctuary comes in. Eckartshausen lays out this three-stage process for how we can, like, tune into that spiritual frequency.
Okay, hit me with the stages.
Stage one is what he calls the moral awakening, or inspiration. Think of it like this inner nudge towards goodness, towards living a more ethical life.
Like a moral compass that's finally calibrated.
You could say that. Then comes the intellectual awakening, or illumination. This is where you start getting real insights into spiritual matters. It's like the fog is clearing, and you're starting to see things more clearly.
Makes sense. What's stage 3?
The big one, the spiritual awakening, or revelation. This is where you directly apprehend spiritual truth. No more metaphors, no more theories. You're experiencing it firsthand. And Eckartshausen says that as we go through these stages, it's like a cloud is slowly lifting from our heart, from the most sacred part of our being.
From our own personal sanctuary, I guess you could say.
Exactly. And as that cloud lifts, we become more and more receptive to the presence of God right here, right now.
It's like we're decluttering our spiritual attic and making space for something bigger to move in. So this whole idea of a sanctuary being clouded over, that kind of naturally leads to another big concept in the book, the invisible celestial church. For those who might not have stumbled across that term before.
It's a doozy, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Eckartshausen basically describes this as a continuous, highly advanced spiritual community that's been around since the fall.
The fall, meaning Adam and Eve and the whole apple situation.
The very same. He says this invisible church is getting direct revelation, like straight from the source. And it's been working behind the scenes to guide humanity ever since we took that first bite. He makes a distinction between this inner church and the outward church, the one we see in the world with all its buildings and institutions.
So, like, there's the public-facing church, and then there's this, like, secret society of super saints pulling the strings from the shadows.
Well, not exactly secret society in the way we usually think of it. Eckartshausen's pretty adamant about that.
Okay, so what is it then? What's this invisible celestial church all about?
He says it's governing all spiritual matters, even though it's invisible to most folks. It works through real internal spiritual activity, not through manipulating worldly events or anything like that.
So no secret handshakes or hooded figures meeting in dimly lit back rooms.
Not quite.
Got it. So what kind of stuff are they doing in this invisible church? What's their MO?
Eckartshausen says they're combining the ancient wisdom of what he calls the Temple of the Ancient Alliance with the Spirit of Jesus Christ, the Interior Alliance. They've got their own internal structure, a school, teachers, even a set of rules for students.
Sounds kind of intense. So how do you join this exclusive club?
Here's the kicker, you don't. Eckartshausen says people become members unexpectedly when they're least expecting it.
Like a spiritual draft pick, you're just walking down the street, minding your own business, and bam, you're in the invisible church.
Something like that. And just to make things even more mind-blowing, Eckartshausen sees this invisible church as eventually becoming this theocratic republic that's going to govern the whole world.
Talk about a long game. It's interesting how Eckartshausen lays all this out, not like he's speculating, but like he's speaking with some serious authority.
Yeah, he claims to be speaking with full knowledge and ambassadorial powers, like he's representing this invisible church directly. The editor of this edition of The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary really emphasizes Eckartshausen's sincerity. They say his whole life is kind of proof of concept for this stuff, like he lived what he preached.
Which begs the question, who was this Karl von Eckartshausen guy? What's his story? Fill us in.
Well, buckle up, because it's a bit of a ride. Born in 1752, illegitimate son of a Bavarian count. That whole born out of wedlock thing apparently weighed on him his whole life.
I can imagine.
Contributed to a certain melancholy, a tendency to withdraw. But he was still close to his family, which is interesting.
Complicated family dynamics. Always a good starting point for an interesting life, right?
Right. So despite this personal baggage, Eckartshausen, he's got a pretty successful career. Becomes an Aulic counselor, that's like a high-ranking advisor, then a library censor, and finally, keeper of the archives.
Dude was climbing the ladder.
Oh, yeah. And on top of that, he was a prolific writer. We're talking 69 books on everything from science and the arts to politics and even what was considered back then occult sciences.
69 books. That's commitment right there.
No kidding. Most of them are pretty obscure now, but he did have one devotional book, God is the Purest Love, that was a huge hit back in the day.
A bestseller.
Went through like 60 editions. Crazy, right?
So we've got this guy, super smart, well-connected, respected in his time.
Not just some fringe mystic, no. He was in the thick of things.
But he's also talking about this invisible church, this hidden spiritual order. When you throw those terms around, it's easy for things to get a little, well, misconstrued.
Yeah, people tend to jump to conclusions.
So let's clear the air. What does Eckartshausen specifically say this inner church is not?
He's very explicit on this point. It's not some shadowy organization pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to control the visible church. In fact, the editor says that idea is straight up refuted by the most authoritative source on the matter.
Safe to assume that means Eckartshausen himself.
You got it. He also clarifies that it's not just some kind of hive mind of super saints, or the combined will of all the holy folks throughout history.
So not a collective consciousness either.
Nope. While there's definitely this sense of connection between members, it's not bound by space and time the way we normally understand them.
Okay, so if it's not a secret society or a collective mind, then what is it? What's the key to understanding this invisible church, according to Eckartshausen?
He says it all comes down to the individual. It's about that dormant spiritual faculty we talked about earlier, the one that lets us perceive the spiritual world directly. As this faculty wakes up within us, we start to experience a deeper union with the divine.
It's like our own personal portal to the spiritual realm is opening up.
Exactly. And through that opening, we connect with this vast spiritual congregation that exists beyond all the outward forms and structures of religion. Eckartshausen calls this the first fruits of immortality. And this inner congregation, because of the interconnectedness of humanity and this whole principle of shared holiness, they actually act as the true guiding force for the visible church.
So it's less about an external hierarchy and more about this internal network of awakened individuals.
Exactly. It's like a spiritual ecosystem where the health of the whole is dependent on the health of each individual part.
Makes you think about the ripple effect, right? Like even our own personal spiritual growth can contribute to something much bigger. Now, I know the editor mentioned a few other books that seem to be on the same wavelength as Eckartshausen. Anything worth checking out for those who want to dive deeper?
Oh yeah, a few gems for sure.
Hmm.
There's The Mystery of the Cross, published anonymously in French back in 1732. Apparently, it was a big influence on a lot of folks, but people kept their love for it on the down low.
A hidden gem, you could say.
Exactly. Then there are these dramatic poems by the German poet Zacharias Werner, specifically The Templars in Cyprus and The Brothers of the Cross.
Templars and secret brotherhoods. Sounds like we're headed down another rabbit hole.
It's a deep one, that's for sure. Werner himself was involved in some pretty occult circles during the French Revolution, and later in life, he became a Catholic priest.
Okay, now that's an interesting trajectory.
Right, from occult circles to the priesthood. Makes you wonder. The editor also mentions a book from Russia, translated into French in 1801, called Some Characteristics of the Interior Church. Apparently, it draws some pretty strong connections between the mystery of the cross and Eckartshausen's teachings.
So we're starting to see some patterns here, some recurring themes across different authors and traditions.
Definitely. And last but not least, there's this massive 7-volume series called New Spiritual Discourses, published in 1738. It's basically advocating for direct spiritual experience over rigid adherence to dogma.
Sounds like it's right up our alley.
It is. And the editor even suggests that there might be a shared authorship, or at least a close intellectual connection, between these new spiritual discourses and Eckartshausen's own work.
So maybe Eckartshausen wasn't working in complete isolation. Maybe there's a whole network of thinkers exploring these ideas.
It's certainly possible. One more thing about Eckartshausen that's worth noting. Despite all this talk about inner transformation and the invisible church, he remained a loyal member of the external church his whole life.
So he wasn't trying to start a revolution or break away from organized religion?
Not at all. The editor suggests that Eckartshausen believed that real change starts from within the individual. Like, you got to get your own house in order before you go trying to fix the world.
It's about personal transformation first and foremost. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've got a sense of who Eckartshausen was, what this whole invisible church thing is all about, and the basic idea of awakening this inner spiritual faculty. Now, let's dig into some of the specifics of what Eckartshausen actually says in The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. What are some of the recurring themes or observations that jump out when you read his letters?
Well, right off the bat, in letter 1, Eckartshausen goes pretty hard on his own era. This is the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Light, but he's calling it an Age of Twilight.
Ouch. Not pulling any punches there.
Nope. He's basically saying that despite all this talk of progress and reason, there's a lot of confusion and uncertainty about fundamental moral and intellectual principles. He criticizes what he sees as the idolatry of the intellect.
Meaning?
Basically, this over-reliance on sensory perception and pure logic to figure out what's true. He's asking, have all this emphasis on reason actually made us happier or more moral? Because he's looking around and seeing a lot of suffering and egotism.
So he's not convinced that reason alone is the answer.
Not by a long shot. He proposes that true wisdom and genuine morality, they come from Jesus Christ, who he sees as the embodiment of both.
So back to Jesus again.
Yep. And Eckartshausen believes that you can experience these qualities, this wisdom and love, directly through what he calls the interior sensorium.
Which is?
Basically, this spiritual faculty that operates beyond our normal senses and our logical mind. He says that a true Christian already discovers the basic principles of morality, loving God, and loving your neighbor in their own heart. And he equates this love with Christ dwelling within us.
So it's less about figuring things out with our heads and more about feeling it in our hearts.
Exactly. He sees the intellect, when it's operating on its own, relying just on sensory data, as being pretty limited. It can only grasp the surface of things, not the deeper truths. He uses this really vivid analogy comparing the limited light of the senses to the faint glow of rotting wood.
Okay, that's a striking image. What's the alternative? What's the brighter light?
He contrasts that rotting wood with the brilliance of sunshine, which he equates to the light of transcendental reason. This is the kind of reason that's informed by the spiritual faculty, by the interior sensorium. And he says absolute truth only exists for the interior and spiritual man.
Meaning?
The person who's cultivated this inner sense, who's opened themselves up to that higher level of understanding.
So it's not just about being smart in the conventional sense. It's about developing this whole other way of knowing.
Right. It's about going beyond the head and into the heart, into the depths of your being.
Okay, so we've got this idea of the interior and spiritual man, and that ties back into the fall of humanity, right? How does Eckartshausen view the fall in relation to this, like, close-off inner sense that most of us seem to have?
He sees the fall as this kind of devolution, where we became way too reliant on our physical senses, to the point that we basically shut down our spiritual perception. He describes it as this thick film covering our inner eye, muffling our inner ear. It's like we've gone deaf and blind to the spiritual world. And the process of opening back up to that world, that's what he calls the mystery of the new man.
So the fall is less about disobeying God and more about losing touch with our own spiritual nature.
Exactly. It's about forgetting who we really are, forgetting that we have this capacity for direct connection with the divine. And the mystery of the new man is about reclaiming that connection. It's about spiritual rebirth.
Sounds kind of intense. Is this like a sudden awakening, or is it more of a gradual process?
He outlines a clear progression for how this spiritual rebirth happens. He calls it the opening of our spiritual sensorium.
And how many steps are in this opening process?
3. The first degree, which gets us to the moral level of understanding, he calls inspiration. It's that initial nudge towards goodness that we talked about earlier.
Got it. What's next?
The second degree, which opens us up to the spiritual and intellectual realms, that's interior illumination. This is where we start to get those deeper insights, that clarity of understanding. And finally, the third degree, this is the full breakthrough, where we can directly perceive the spiritual world. He calls this revelation. It's the foundation of all true spiritual visions and understanding.
So it's like a step-by-step journey from inspiration to illumination to full-blown revelation.
Exactly, a gradual unfolding of our spiritual potential.
Okay, so given this emphasis on inner experience, where does external religion fit into all of this? What about all the rituals, the ceremonies, the symbols that we associate with traditional faith? Does Eckartshausen just toss all that out the window?
He doesn't dismiss it. He sees those outward expressions as guideposts, as pointers towards the inner truths. He says they're like a letter expressive outwardly of the spirit of truth residing in the interior sanctuary.
So the outer forms are meant to lead us to the inner essence.
Precisely. He explains that all the symbols and ceremonies of external worship, they're actually based on spiritual realities. Things like the fall, the reconciliation with God, the atonement.
And these rituals are meant to help us connect with those realities on a deeper level.
That's the idea. But he cautions that it's easy to get caught up in the outward forms and forget the inner meaning. He says the true essence can get lost if we become too attached to the literal interpretations.
It's like mistaking the map for the territory.
A perfect analogy. He even envisions a future where the night of symbol will disappear and all the mysteries will reveal themselves in the splendor of full truth. A beautiful image, right?
It is a world where the outer and the inner are fully aligned.
Where nature, reason, and divine revelation all come together in harmony.
Okay, so what's the ultimate point of all this inner seeking, this spiritual regeneration? What's the end goal for Eckartshausen? What are we striving for?
He's very clear about that. It's about reunion of man with God. He talks about rebirth not just as accepting certain beliefs, but as a total transformation of our intelligence, our heart, our will, our entire being.
So it's not just about believing the right things, it's about becoming something new.
Exactly. He calls it real possession of God, this direct experiential knowledge of Christ living within you. And he stresses the importance of living faith, a faith that's not just intellectual, but something you live and breathe. It's about encountering the divine within yourself.
Eckartshausen also mentions this idea of a body of sin that can get in the way of this reunion, right?
He does. He talks about this slimy matter in our blood, this gluten that he calls the body of sin. He connects it to our lower nature, our animal instincts, and he sees it as a major roadblock on the spiritual path. He describes it as a kind of ferment of sin that constantly messes with us, blocking the positive influence of the spirit.
So it's like this internal sabotage mechanism that keeps us stuck in our old patterns.
Pretty much. And that's why he emphasizes the need for a physician, who he identifies as Jesus, and a remedy for this spiritual corruption.
So the whole process, from awakening our inner sense to overcoming this body of sin, it's all about ultimately reuniting with God, and that's made possible by Jesus.
You got it. He sees the incarnation and sacrifice of Jesus as the pivotal event in human history, the thing that makes this reunion possible. He calls it the royal and priestly science of regeneration.
Royal and priestly science. There's a phrase you don't hear every day.
I know, right? He says this science leads to power over nature. That's the royal aspect. And it also sanctifies and perfects us, the priestly aspect.
So it's about becoming more fully human, more fully ourselves, in union with the divine. Wow, this has been a really deep dive, even for us. Eckartshausen really paints a compelling picture of this inner spiritual world, this hidden dimension of faith that most of us never even realize is there.
What really strikes me is how he tries to bridge the gap between personal mystical experience and organized religion, suggesting that there's this deeper unifying truth that connects them both.
And that truth is accessible to each of us if we're willing to do the inner work.
Exactly. It makes you question what we might be missing out on by focusing so much on the external, on the purely rational and material aspects of life.
It's like Eckartshausen is saying, hey, there's a whole other level to this reality, but you got to look inward to find it.
And that brings us to a question for all of you listening. What if our modern obsession with the rational, with the measurable and the quantifiable, has actually clouded over our own inner sanctuary, blocking us from experiencing this deeper level of spiritual awareness that Eckartshausen is talking about?
It's a sobering thought, but also a hopeful one. Because if we can become aware of that cloud, maybe we can start to lift it. Maybe we can rediscover that connection to the divine that's been there all along. So if you're intrigued by these ideas, we encourage you to seek out The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary for yourself. And definitely check out some of those other books we mentioned, like The Mystery of the Cross and Werner's poems. There's a whole world of wisdom waiting to be uncovered.
And who knows, maybe you'll even start to experience that reunion of man with God that Eckartshausen talks about. It's a journey worth taking, that's for sure.
And that's a wrap for this deep dive into The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep exploring the hidden depths of our collective human experience. There's always more to discover.